Hello and welcome back to Grace to Endure. Today we're going to start with Daniel chapter 8, part 1, and we're going to do a quick background before we get started in Daniel chapter 8 specifically. Don't worry, we're going to come back to Daniel chapter 7. I know we haven't finished that, but we're still trying to answer that question, what will the world look like before the 10 and the Antichrist show up? I want to make a good list of what that time frame of Babylon time frame will look like so that when it's in front of our face, we can watch for that sign and know for sure biblically what we're looking at. So before we get started on Daniel chapter 8, I want to make a really good point about hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is actually just being able to interpret the Bible well with knowledge, and there are certain rules. One of those rules is that you cannot let your personal experience get in the way and taint your idea of what the text means. And there is something that happens here in Daniel chapter 8 specifically with Jerome. And Jerome is the one that the majority of the commentaries borrow from his idea on Daniel chapter 8. That's why I'm bringing him up. And Jerome was very excited to see Porphyry, who was a pagan. He was so excited to see Porphyry acknowledging that some, not all, but some of the prophecies were lining up with history. And so then Jerome just jumped on board and unfortunately borrowed a lot of Porphyry's interpretations as well with chapter 8. And we want to be sure not to do that. We want to instead have a method of just comparing scripture with scripture and letting scripture speak for itself. So we're going to take a really in-depth look before we get started on Daniel chapter 8. And the reason why I find this to be so important is I actually think Daniel chapter 8 is one of the chapters of the Bible that has the most details about the great apostasy. And so I think it's very important that we not put them into the past when really we need to see them for the future. I want us to think for a minute about the nature of traps. If you're going to lay a trap, you have to go ahead of time. If you're a hunter, you've got to go out into the woods and you've got to lay the trap well before the one you're trying to deceive that everything's fine gets there, well before they arrive. And so you lay the trap and then you camouflage it with leaves or some sort of thing to make it look like there's nothing different going on the ground and everything's fine. Everything blends in. There's nothing to be surprised about. Let me consider with you this verse. Luke 21:34 is an end times passage. Be on guard so that your minds are not dulled from carousing, drunkenness, and worries of life. Worries of life just means everyday life. Or that day will come on you unexpectedly like a trap. So the Bible actually compares this to a trap, which means a trap has been laid down ahead of time by someone who's trying to get you caught. And I would propose that there's a trap in Daniel 8 that's already been laid down ahead of time. And I'm going to try to point this out. Okay, so let's take a look at where a lot of the commentaries take a lot of their views from. Of course, they get their views of Daniel chapter 8 from Jerome, and Jerome borrows a lot of those interpretations from Porphyry. Porphyry was a pagan who wrote 15 volumes called Against the Christians. His view, if you look on the left side, is that everything in the book of Daniel is either fulfilled by or before Antiochus Epiphanes, so it's not too much of a shock that the second point is true, that he calls the little horn of Daniel chapter 8 Antiochus Epiphanes. All right. What happens when Porphyry is looking at the Bible is he sees some similarities in history and he's trying to disprove prophecy, so he just crams everything into the past before Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's not scrutinizing the rest of the details, nor does he know about prophetic foreshortening. Prophetic foreshortening is when, because prophecy is cyclical regularly, in other words, history repeats itself. That's a saying, a well-known saying even now today that we say. So it doesn't repeat itself exactly, though, but just it can have some similarities. So that's just always been true. So it is with prophecy that there will be a prophecy that has, let's say that it has 20 details. and let's say 6 of those details happen, you can't say that the whole prophecy happened. No, it has a future fulfillment that is going to be in full, and that is the prophecy. It's for that. Okay, so Porphyry doesn't know about any of that. He just sees some similarities to things in history and wants to discredit the Bible. That's all his view is. That's all he's trying to do. Jerome then comes along and is like, ooh, see how Porphyry, even an unbeliever, how he can see that some of these historical events have happened? Therefore, yeah, all these views and interpretations of Porphyry are correct. They have happened. That's not good. We do not need to do that. We don't require that. And so I just do not think Jerome went far enough in refuting Porphyry and having a different interpretation than him. So let's look in the center of the page. Actually, right before we go there, let me say Porphyry's view that anything that came after that wasn't fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes was just made up. Okay, so let's go to the center of the page and we'll see Jerome's view is that Daniel is split up into 2 parts. He believes that 1 through 22 is in the past. Okay, he agrees with Porphyry on that. That's where he gets that idea. Okay, and then B, he believes that point B shows you, if you're looking at the middle of your screen, that verses 23 through 27 are still in the future. In fact, he would say that's talking about the Antichrist. So he splits them up into 2 totally different interpretations. Okay? An example of that is that he believes that the little horn of 9 through 14, verses 9 through 14, are also Antiochus Epiphanes. He agrees with Porphyry. And yet he would say over there, verses 23 through 26, which are actually talking about the same person, he's going to say that's the Antichrist. There's a major problem with this, though. And I'm going to try to explain that to you. So, I don't know if you know this about me. Some of you do, some of you don't. When I started, the reason why I went to Bible college was because I wanted to go into counseling. However, my husband was in Bible college already, and he said this to me. He said, well, do you think you'd be a better counselor if you got to know God and did and studied theology, or if you just studied people and maybe their problems, and which one do you think would help you be a better counselor? And so I thought about that, and I thought, you know what, that's actually true. And that was actually very good advice. I'm so glad I took it. I'm so glad I did theology as my major. And so as a result, even though I wasn't trying to be a pastor or anything, being that I'm a woman and shouldn't be doing that, I still did sit in on hermeneutics. Loved it. I took hermeneutics classes, preaching classes, expositing classes, all of that, and ate it up. Absolutely loved it. So, however, what I learned many things in those classes, but one of the things that I learned is there's this huge hermeneutical no-no that Jerome is doing here. Nobody does this with no credible people do this with any other passages of Scripture that I know of. But they do it here in Daniel 8 because they kind of just look in the commentaries and they just copy what the commentaries mostly say, because maybe it's not their area of expertise. I don't know. I don't really know why they do it. And then they're just copying Jerome and not looking up the history of where Jerome gets his ideas. So it's very unfortunate, but it's also wrong, especially what is done in this chapter. And that is that the Bible already tells us that the second half of Daniel chapter 8 is an interpretation to a vision. We have no right to call it anything else. You cannot take an interpretation of a vision, if this is the vision and this is the interpretation, you can't give the interpretation a different meaning than you give the vision. Okay, here's an example. In the Gospels, when Jesus is giving parables to people, he would give parables to the masses, right? And then sometimes, often, he would turn to his own disciples and say, now I'm going to give you the interpretation. I won't give it to them, but I'll tell it to you. And so he would give an interpretation to some parables. You can't take an interpretation to a parable and give it its own little exclusive meaning over here, and then give the parable that's got some other meaning. You cannot do that. The meaning and interpretation of the parable is one and the same with the parable. Okay? It is a hermeneutic no-no to do anything else. Okay? It's just plain wrong. Okay, so let's read in verses 15 and 16 and see what God is saying in Scripture, because God wrote Scripture, right? That's what I mean by that. What does God say that Daniel chapter 8 and following, the second half, what does he say it is? Because we know that from verses 1 through 14, it's just Daniel writing down the vision. Okay, so that's just the vision. So what does God say the rest of it is? Verse 15, well, I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it. There stood before me someone who appeared to be a man. I heard a voice calling from the middle of the Ulai, Gabriel, explain the vision to this man. So right there we know that this is just an explanation to the vision. So the explanation is not going to have a different meaning of its own. It can't. Okay, so just in review, this view is the best view that I have found, and I'm going to call it comparing Scripture with Scripture. And so just some of this I have already mentioned, but let's look at it again. Point 1, although prophecy is cyclical, meaning that it can have reoccurring parts to it, it actually is always referring to one final fulfillment. And that is what I am most concerned about, because I believe that for Daniel chapter 8 is still in the future. Number 2, Gabriel has already told us for Daniel chapter 8 that the second part of Daniel chapter 8 is just the interpretation or meaning of the vision. And so they're one and the same. Each side, if you will, might give a little different of details, but they're building one on each other and are talking about the same time period and people. Okay, and point number 3, I actually believe that this view that I'm going to give you, that Daniel 8 is actually just reiterating that same last beast kingdom that we've talked about in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17, and other places in Scripture which I'm not going to get into in this series. Okay, so before we get started on Daniel chapter 8, I want to say one thing. Even though we can know for sure, point 2, that the interpretation that Jerome gives just cannot be true because it breaks a very important rule. This view that I am about to give is the best view I have found, and I really do wholeheartedly believe it. However, I'm not going to be dogmatic and say for sure that every single thing is exactly interpreted perfectly, although I think it is. If it's not correct, obviously it won't come true the way that I'm saying. And again, I just want to keep reiterating, I'm not prophesying. I'm just giving an interpretation of a prophecy that's already been written. So that's important to remember, is if obviously this turns out to not happen the way that I'm going to explain it, then I'm going to change my view too. But we can definitely say that the way that Jerome has done it, with splitting the meaning from the vision, that's definitely not true. So we need to look for a fresh look and try to figure it out on our own, and with Scripture and with other believers, and not use the commentaries that are borrowing from Jerome, and then also, unfortunately, Porphyry. Okay, so let's get started in the following videos on Daniel chapter 8 and see what we can find.